You're listening to 247 Real Talk. I'm your host, Julian Perry. Joining me for this episode is Mr. Kevin McCall as we discussed another entry into the series, Losing a Child to Homicide. We'll be right back. So good evening, Kevin. Welcome to 247 Real Talk. Thank you for joining me for this episode.
Oh, thank you for having me, Julian. It's my pleasure.
Yeah, it's my pleasure to have you here as well. So, as I do with all of my episodes, with Real Talk, we kind of jump right into the Real Talk. So, from my introduction, the audience knows that this is another episode in a mini-series that I have created as part of the podcast that deals with losing a child to homicide. Why don't we start off by you giving us a bit of a background of who Kevin McCall is or who Kevin McCall was prior to losing your son?
Sure. I grew up in the Philadelphia area. I raised my family in Downingtown, Pennsylvania with my wife, Joanne. I was a plumbing contractor for 30 years in that Philadelphia area. In 2007, we decided to move to Florida. At that time, my son Kevin was graduating from the University of Tampa, and my son Ryan was going into his junior year at the University of Tampa. At 2007, we decided to move to Florida, and start a new life with the kids. Eventually we're becoming empty nesters. And we moved in December of 2007. And in August of 2009, it was the day that my son Ryan was murdered.
Okay, so this episode obviously deals with when that happened and everything afterwards. So, in as many details as you are willing to provide, tell us about that day.
Yeah, the morning started with my wife going to work about 5:30 in the morning. I was working on some different projects since I retired from the plumbing business down here. Since I moved down here, and sitting, getting all ready for the day. Had some meetings that I had planned. And around 7:15, I was in the kitchen grabbing another cup of coffee. I heard a knock on the door. It wasn't a normal knock. It was a very hard, rapid knocks. And kind of stunned me. I thought, something's wrong on the street. Emergency, that's the kind of knock it felt like. And I started to walk down my hallway, and then there was two more hard knocks and then a rapid knock. And as I got to the door to open it up, I started to get a funny feeling in my stomach. I opened the door, and standing there were three officers, and at that moment, I knew that something happened to somebody in my family. With the progression of what the officers were, it was a lieutenant, a sergeant, and a corporal. And at this time, at 7:15 in the morning, I'm thinking it's my wife.
So I'm sorry, I'm going to jump in and pause you there. So at this point, when had you seen your son prior to?
I seen him the day before. Excuse me. My eldest son, Kevin, was buying his first house, and we were moving in his house over in Tampa, and Ryan was there to help us move him in. And I seen him around 5:30. He asked me if he can go home, and they were having a birthday party at their house just off of campus. And I said, sure, go ahead, be careful, behave, have a good night. And that was on August 18th.
Now, was he staying on campus, or were you expecting him home during that night?
No, he was staying off campus at a home that they were renting for his senior year.
Okay. So go ahead.
So at this point, the police were at the door, and they asked me who I was, and so I'm standing there throwing through my head that it's my wife, and I told them who I was, Kevin McCall, and at that moment they said, "Is your wife at home?" And I said, "No, she's at work," and then I knew it was one of my children. So they're asking me, can we come in the house? And very reluctant, I'm standing at the door. I didn't want them to come in the house because I knew at this time, once they entered the house, I would know what happened and what was going on.
So that was an effort to. Sorry, I'm gonna cut you several times if you don't mind, because I want the audience to actually sort of live those moments, as you tell the story, to understand the impact of this and the whole meaning of this miniseries. So at this point, what you're basically saying is that you wanted to pause any bad news. You sort of wanted to, we do it in life sometimes. Like, well, if we don't do something, then something that maybe already happened won't occur anyway. You kind of had that premonition at the same time, hoping that somehow, unrealistically, you could stop it.
Right. That's exactly. I was trying to delay the inevitable, if you want to say. And they pushed. They kept. Let me come in, Mr. McCall. So of course, reluctantly, I let him in the door. Walked down the hallway into my kitchen, and as I'm walking down, I started trying to figure out, okay, which one could it be? It's not my daughter. She's still living up in. My daughter Kimberly's still in Pennsylvania. And I know they wouldn't be coming to the door for that. I'd probably get a phone call. My son Kevin just moved into his house. I knew he was busy. So I was calculating in my head that it was Ryan, and he probably died in a car accident. That's where I was at. And we got to the end of the hallway into my kitchen. I'm standing by the counter. The lieutenant, was standing there. Said, "Mr. McCall, news that none of us ever want to tell anybody, but your son Ryan was murdered last night, early this morning." And I looked at him, and it didn't calculate. I'm still thinking car accident. And I asked him what, and he just said to me, "Your son Ryan was murdered in a robbery attempt over in Tampa early this morning." And I just proceeded. I was very calm. I told myself, as soon as they were coming in the door, that I couldn't react. I had to stay very calm. No matter what they told me, I knew that the rest of the day was going to be very hectic. I knew I had to get to my wife, and tell my two children. So I went on to ask them, where was he shot? And they started to tell me where in Tampa. And I was more curious where he was shot on his body more than where the location was.
So let's pause for a second again there. Mm-hmm. And you get the news that your son was murdered. Before we go on with the story, I'm really interested, and I think my audience would be interested to understand, even though, so there's probably two things that I can imagine that are happening to you at that point. There's the part of you that wants to go through the procedural part with the police, the conversation. But what about the parent? What were you feeling outside of that, just curiosity or whatever, that, for lack of a better term, of hearing what happened? You just got hit with this ton of bricks. What was that like? Were you numb, or what was that like?
Yeah, I look back now. Yes, I was. Once I heard the news, and especially that he was murdered, I was probably going into sort of a shock mode, and a mode to, as a father and a husband, to go into that protection mode. So everything else, I just start cutting off and focusing forward on all the details. So I was starting to just get myself in a more like just a a straight tunnel feeling, like, okay, tell me everything. So this is what I need to know. What do I need to do? And that's where I was probably at that time.
Okay, so that's understandable. I can almost picture that. So tell us the details now of what happened.
They started to tell me the details where it was, and then I asked them, no. I mean on his body. I don't know why I asked that question. I guess being the father and standing there, I just wanted to know, is he really dead? So he explained where they actually knew where, everything they needed to know. It's almost like they knew the questions I was going to be asking. They answered quickly. He explained on the body where Ryan was shot. He ran, he was shot in the left arm and went through his chest and into his heart. And he ran about 50 to 60 feet and then just fell over. They told me the whole thing. And as they were telling me this, the lieutenant, the corporal, walked behind me, which I thought was kind of strange. And I'm like, huh. So I'm thinking he must see something that I'm going into shock, that he wanted to make sure that that something didn't happen to me physically. That's the feeling I was getting. So I was really starting to keep myself focused completely then, because I guess they could see more that I could feel at the same time.
Okay, so
and then
this was he alone when this happened? The robbery?
No, he was with a friend of his. They were both of them were walking home from the party at a college bar, and they were walking home back to his house he was renting. And the man jumped out, asked them for everything they had, and hit the pistol whip his friend. And his friend turned to Ryan and said, "We got to get out of here." And his friend took off. And in the meantime, his friend took off and fell. He heard a gunshot, but never knew if Ryan ran past him, because Ryan was on the cross-country track team at the university. So he's thinking Ryan got past him, and they just shot at him. The person just shot at him. And he ran all the way back to the house and ran in where all his other friends were and said, "Is Ryan here?" And they said, "What do you mean? Ryan's with you." And at that moment, he yelled, "Call 911." And they called 911. And by the time they got back, which is about a block and a half away from where Ryan was shot, the police were already there and holding them back from seeing Ryan. So they didn't know if Ryan was dead. They didn't know what was going on. They were trying to keep them under control at that point.
So, all right, I'm not going to put you through too much of that recount. I just thought that my audience needs to understand that foundation to get the rest of the story. So what happens next?
Mm-hmm. So in the meantime, in the kitchen, the corporal says, "Would you want to talk to the detective that's handling the case?" And I said, "Sure." So it was really strange how this whole thing goes through this. He picks up my cell phone and dials the number into my cell phone and says, "Now you have it." The detective's phone number. So I answer the phone. The detective says, "I'm Detective Sal Algieri, and I have news that I really hate to tell any father." And he tells me again about Ryan. So now I know it's really true. That really told me at that point that, Ryan was murdered and he's not here anymore. So I asked him, what do I need to do? He gave me a bunch of lists. I have to, he'll keep me abreast of what's going on the investigation. They have Michael, Ryan's friend, down at the precinct, ask me questions to him, and that I would need to call the coroner's office to give, and they'll give you the information that they're going to need. So I said, okay, took down the information, and at that point, the day starts to move on.
Okay, so before we get into the next part I want to hear about, before we get into more of the details of the whole process, is you are now at some point where I'm assuming that you're the only one in your family that knows what happens, and you need to relay this information to your wife and to your other children.
Right. So at this point, the sheriffs say to me, do you want us to go and tell your wife at work? And I said, no, you can't do that. It's our place of business. They said, well, can we take you? And I said, no, I don't think that's a good idea. I'll get there. And one of the sheriffs said to me, well, you shouldn't go yourself. And I said, I won't. I said, I got to notify my 2 children, and I want to be able to tell my wife. So they said, okay, remember, when we walk out this door, it's going to be all over the news, because we're going to notify the Tampa police that you've been notified. I said, okay, so get to your wife as soon as you can. So I walked them down the hallway, and I closed the door, and I just stood there and like, okay, now what do I do? So I started calling, because I had to get to my daughter. I called a friend of mine that lives up there in Philadelphia, and told him what happened, if he could go get my daughter. In the meantime, I'm going to be calling her, but I just wanted him to get over there as soon as he could at her workplace. So as I'm walking down the hall, I'm calling my daughter at work to tell her, and she answers the phone. She says, what are you calling me so early for, Dad? Is Mom okay? And I said, yeah, Mom's fine. Is it Snoopy, which is our dog? No, yeah, he's fine. And I said, Kimberly, can you get some coworkers, and please sit down if you're not sitting down. And she really started to freak out. So she got a coworker, and I proceeded to tell her what happened. And of course, she screamed at work. And I tried to calm her, to a point. I said, Mom doesn't know, Kevin doesn't know. I hate to cut you off, but I have to get moving here. So I get off the phone with her, and then I proceed to call my son. He doesn't answer. I leave him a message. In the meantime, I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to get to my wife. He calls back. I tell him, Kevin, I don't know how to tell you this. And I tell him that, Ryan died last night, and you just, you're lying to me. There's no way that happened. I said, yeah. I said, I got to get to Mom, and I don't want to cut them off. I want to be able, but I knew what I had to do. And I asked them, if you're coming, can you please have someone bring you? I do not want you coming yourself. So I get off the phone with him, and I'm still thinking, okay, let me get changed. And my neighbor comes to the door, knocks on the door, and I open the door, and she looked at me, and she said, was it Ryan? And I said, yes. And I'm looking at her, well, how do you guys know? And here, it was all over the news all morning, but no names, just a UT student was murdered. And I watch the news every day, and this morning, I didn't watch the news at all in the morning. And they seen 3 police cars at the house. So I said, well, I got to go get my wife. Can you get your husband and take me there? So I go in, I get changed, get ready to go. We get in the car, and Jim, her husband, just looks at me and says, what are you going to do? I said, I got no idea what I'm going to do. It's just, I have no idea. And it's a 10, 15-minute ride to get to where my wife works, and I'm trying to call family members the whole way there and can't get anybody. So I get to her place of work, and it's a restaurant. So I walk in, and she sees me right away. My wife, she's a cashier behind the counter, and I walk out of the way, and I walk into another area of the store area of the restaurant, and a coworker is there, and I say, can you get your boss to get Joanne out? And I went up, and I said, Joanne, you got to go. And she said, why? I says, I called the doctor, and I'm having chest pains. I had no idea what to say, and I got to get to the hospital. I want you to go with me. And she's going, no, and she's not really believing me, but she's not sure. So she starts to go get her boss, and I go to the coworker. I said, "You have to get her out of here. The worst thing has happened to a parent today to us." So she runs. Her boss comes out and says, "Joanne, get out. Go with your husband. He needs you right now." We get out of the place of business. I get I go to the car, and I'm sitting there in there, and I'm looking at her, and she said, "What's wrong?" I said, something really bad happened this morning." I said, "What happened? Who is it?" And I didn't know what to say. "Is it Ryan? Was he in a car accident?" And I just couldn't get the words out of my mouth. And I just said, "Ryan's dead." And she just, "No, you're not. You're lying to me. What happened? He's all right. He's alive." And I said, "He was murdered last night, or early this morning, walking home from a party with Michael." And she didn't believe me. Even though she believed me, she wasn't believing me. And she just started to go into shock at that moment.
Wow, I'm gonna even hearing you recount that, all this time later, and it's as a parent myself, I'm almost, as I listen to you in that moment, imagining but trying not to imagine. I don't know. I mean, I can almost understand exactly how you behave, because I think I would. I don't even know. I don't have words for it. I mean, I'm sure my audience, when they hear this episode, are going to be, especially parents like myself, or that. All I can say at this point is keep going. I'm really lost for words at this moment.
Mm-hmm. So we all get back in the car, and we're silent all the way back to my house. And I knew this time and I'm already getting phone calls from the media. This is how quick this happened, that I got to her, that is, right at the last moment. And we get home, I walk her in. My neighbor's still here. She takes my wife to, get her changed, just put her something comfortable on. And Joanne goes over and sits on the couch, and she's just in a distant stare. And I know that I'm just a very detailed person. So I think that took over me, that I was able to push it behind me to enough where it was over on the side of me. Not, I know things are going on, but there were some other things I had to do. Never knowing, here we are. I got her at 8:30 in the morning. I bring her home. It's 9 o'clock. And at 20 after 9, I'm calling a funeral director up north, because at this time we didn't know what we were going to do. Were they going to stay down here? We're going to go back up north. So at this point we Joanne's going, "We're taking them up back into Downingtown." So I called the funeral director that I know up there, and knowing that he was going to have to coordinate it with the coroner's office and give him all the details. And he said, "I'm going to start sending you forms." And I had to call the coroner back, give him the dentist office, because they really didn't want us to go see Ryan, which was really a hard thing to do. He said, "We're only going to be able to show you a picture. I really don't recommend you coming if you can get the dental records."
Now, why was that? So, because I'm assuming that the type of shot that you say he got, he himself would not have been disfigured, at least in the face in any way. So, the normal process is for someone, first level relative, to identify the body, right?
Right. And I said that. I said, "Well, why can't we see him?" Because my wife was adamant. She hears me talking. And he said, "I just don't recommend it. We only show a Polaroid or similar photo for identification." I said, "Okay." He said, "Maybe you can come Friday." And at this point, I'm realizing, it's probably the thing not to go see him right now, even though as a parent you want to go see him, because there's other things going on. My wife's in shock. My daughter's flying from Philadelphia. My son Kevin's just arriving. news media is calling on the phone, and people are already delivering food. This is like at 10:30 in the morning. This is all going on, and I knew I had to coordinate the funeral director as soon as we could, so he can get Ryan and get all that done. This is how fast all this has to happen, and I've only known Ryan's been dead for 2 or 3 hours now. So we finish all that up, and I'm just like in an area, I'm just shaking my head like, this isn't happening here. There's no way this is happening. It just feels like you're in a complete dream. Nothing's going, but you're still doing it. And I knew the news media was just constantly calling, and my neighbor worked for one of the news media as a cameraman, and he came over, and I said, what am I going to do? He said, just call a press conference. Just call a press conference, give them a time, and they'll all come. And I just looked at him and said, well, can you write the statement to them? And he goes, yes. So at this moment, this is 10:30, 11:15 in the morning. He writes the press conference release, sends it to all the news media for 3:00 in the afternoon. At this time, my son Kevin arrived, and we were suggested to write a statement, something. He goes, no, I want to write the statement. I said, no. He said, I want to do it. And these are all the things that you're thinking about. And in the meantime, I'm worried about my wife. So I call the doctor. I'm thinking she might need something at this moment. So we get the doctor wants her to come in. So my son Kevin and my neighbor take her to the doctors to get her, something to calm her down if she needs it. In the meantime, he writes the statement. I'm talking to news media still on the phone and telling them there's a conference. It's just a nonstop. And then the detectives call me back, letting me know that Michael Ryan's friend is okay, which I was very concerned about. And and then friends and family were started rolling into the house. And at 3:00, we got the press conference. We stood up on our porch. It started to rain a little bit, and all the news media was there, and Kevin read a statement. My heart was breaking the whole time, showing pictures of Ryan, and you're sitting there going, this is other people. We see this on the news ourselves, and we're standing here doing this. And it's all I'm thinking to myself, and watching Kevin read this, about his brother, who he was, and what he meant to him. And the news media, they asked the questions. They were all very, very, very professional and polite. No one was out of line, which was very refreshing at that moment, knowing that you didn't need any, craziness in your life at that moment. So that ended, and as soon as that ended, my daughter was coming in, Kimberly, from Philadelphia. Her work got her an airplane, got her a limo ride to our house, and she was running up as soon as the press conference was done, and all she said, "Where's Mom at?" And I said, "She's in the house," and she just wanted to get to her mom.
You remember, there's so many things going through my head at the moment, but it's amazing the level of detail that you remember from that day. And I also find it amazing that you've been telling me this story now for almost 30 minutes, and all this is happening on the same day between 7 something in the morning and when your daughter arrived. That's a lot on day one, understanding that that's, I guess, an inherent part of a homicide.
Yeah, that day was so long but so short. It's a weird way to say it, but it just felt like a long, short day.
And so go ahead. Let's keep going with the story. Go ahead.
And so the news media left, and this is about 4 o'clock. Everybody's, a lot of the friends and my family isn't all here because everybody lives up in Philadelphia other than my immediate family, my kids and my son Kevin, and my wife and I and my daughter lived up north. My brother arrives around 6 o'clock, and I opened the door and he just grabbed me. And he just wouldn't let me go. And he came, and then we just came in, and he just couldn't believe what was going on. Then my other brother came in later on that the same thing happened. My mother couldn't fly down, she was in her late 80s by then and had some health issues. So my older brothers had to stay up with her, and, he's apologizing to me on the phone. And I said, that's okay. And in the meantime, we're the victim advocate from, the Tampa's calling already, giving us all the information we need, what we need to do. And the day's not over yet. And this is 7, 8 o'clock at night. She's calling, giving us all the information. And I'm writing everything down. Everything that's being given to me, what we need to do. And my wife's still asking, when can we go see Ryan? This is like 9 o'clock at night. And I said, well, maybe Friday. So the night finishes, then it's on the, so we're on the, so we want, everybody's there. We're waiting for the 11 o'clock news to see if there's anything about the case. So where everybody's on, we turn the 11 o'clock news on, and what starts the news? But a Tampa police officer is murdered in the line of duty the same day, that night. So Ryan's thing's on there, but it's very short. It's more about, of course, the police officer. And of course, your first thought is, okay, this is going to take precedent. And you're thinking, oh, Ryan's case is going to move to the back. And I get a phone call from the detective, knowing this is probably what goes through people's mind. And he said, listen to me, the police officer that was murdered, he would never want us to stop looking for who murdered your son. So don't think we are. And I never asked him. He just knew to call and tell me that. So I betrayed that to my wife. And, I said, this is what, this is what's going on. Everybody left. It's about 11:30, quarter to 12. And of course you go in and you actually do fall asleep. You don't think you are, but you're just so mentally and physically exhausted that you fall asleep. But of course, you wake up early. And the craziest thing is that when I went to sleep that night, I woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning. And the morning that Ryan was murdered, I woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning in a deep sweat. Got up, went to the bed, came back to bed, and I said, man, that's weird. And I didn't feel right. It was 3:02. And I just went back to sleep. I said, I wonder when, it was this really weird feeling. I went back to sleep, never knowing Ryan was murdered at 3 o'clock in the morning.
Wow.
So the next day comes and you think, okay, it's calm, but it's even more of the media want to set up interviews and, come to the house and more people coming, and you're still trying to finalize, the stuff with the funeral director and the coroner. And here I'm signing papers of release for Ryan's body and thinking, and you're still saying to yourself, this isn't happening because we haven't seen Ryan yet. And it's Thursday morning, and then Thursday comes and it's a hectic day. We do a couple news conferences. Friday comes, my wife says, are we going to see Ryan? And I had to convince her to not to go. At this point, I'm thinking it's not good. The funeral director's getting him ready to fly him up to Philadelphia at this point, because we're going to be leaving on Sunday or Monday to go. And, Friday was just like Wednesday and Thursday. News media, and the detective calling, letting me know how they're making out, where they are, when they, and keeping us where his investigation's going. And so the whole weekend was crazy, and then Sunday night itself, we're all, it's only the three of us now alone in the house by ourselves, my wife, or the four of us, I mean, my wife, my daughter, Kimberly, and my son, Kevin. And we're sitting, trying to eat. But then we had to start talking about, what do we do with Ryan? Are we moving back to Philadelphia? Are we going to cremate? Should we cremate him so we can bring him back? Because and you're thinking it's easier to do it that way, and the things that go through your mind. And we talked it over as a family, and my daughter did not want to cremate him, and my wife wasn't sure either. But we came to a decision that it was probably easier to cremate him after we had our services up in Philadelphia. So after a tiring, emotional, crying, getting to that point on Sunday night, that's what we decided to do. On Monday morning, we flew back to Philadelphia, and Ryan was there already.
Okay, so go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I had a thought about whether or not you want. I want to make sure that as we go through this and as you relay this to the audience, I'm just checking, to see how you feel about giving the details.
Oh, I don't mind at all.
Okay, so you keep going. We're listening.
Yeah. This was part of my life. So we get to Philadelphia, and we end up going back to the neighborhood that we raised our children, and are staying at our neighbor's house. Became friends across the street from the house that we sold, to move. But we lived there for 20 years and raised my family there. And we get there, and Joanne's going, when we going, she's on, pins and needles to go see Ryan at the funeral director. So I called the funeral director, and I said, hey, we want to come over. And, and he thinks we're just coming over to sit and talk to him. Okay. He said, well, bring some clothes for Ryan, what you want to put him in. So we go over to the director, we go in, we sit down, and I just look at him, and I said, hey, John, can we see Ryan? And he looked at me, and I said, well, he's not ready yet. I said, well, we haven't seen him yet since he was murdered. So he says, hold on. He has some clothes. Yeah, my wife and my daughter are scurrying. They brought a couple different outfits, I guess, for him. And they give him one, and he says, are you sure? Because you won't get these clothes back. They grab them. They scurry in again, get some more clothes that they thought might be more appropriate, and gave him Ryan's running clothes, or clothes that looked like Ryan, shorts and high socks and sneakers. And so we're sitting in the office waiting, and we're talking about what we're going to do with him, and how the ceremony and how that it's all going to go. And then they come out and they say, okay, he's ready. And we walk in the room, and he's all dressed up, just laying there. And you're thinking, well, why doesn't he get up? And he's just on a gurney. And none of us walked right up. We all kind of walked in a circle, and not sure. And I walked up, and my wife walked up with me, and I just rubbed his face, and he had a little beard, 5 o'clock shadow feels like it was starting on his face. And we just, my wife just stood and stared and just looked at him and said, why did you go out? Something that a mother would say. And my son and my daughter, they stood back a little bit, and then everybody finally was able to gather themselves enough to walk up and, touch him and look at him and talk to him. But it was 4 or 5 days, and now that made it was really true that it happened, because we were living in news media and police and family members and food coming in and out of the house and this happening, but never knowing, is he really dead? So at that point, we maybe 15 minutes we stayed with him and went back, finished all the details. And then, we walked by the room and he was still in there, and we all just said, "We'll see you later, Ryan." And he left, and there was just a knot in your stomach and sickness and just pure shock still. You're in shock, but there's nothing you can do about it. And there's not much talking between the four of us, which I thought was strange at the time, but I think that's kind of a normal place you go. No one knows what to say or do. And we go back, and this is a Monday, and we go back another day. What's it, Monday, and then Tuesday. Not much was happening, because we weren't going to have the services until Thursday and Friday. So we just hung with family, more family, because most of my family's up there. So it was more, again, the same thing, that we were living in Florida with everybody coming and going for like 2 or 3 days until we come up to the night of the viewing. So we get there, he tells us to come early. He sends a limo, we go early, and we spend some time with Ryan ourselves, and everybody, we all, the four of us just almost, just held hands and hugged each other, and just wanted to make sure that we all knew we loved each other. That, we weren't sure if everything was going to be okay, but we're all here together with each other, even with Ryan, in the room. And we ended up, the service, the viewing lasted 2.5 hours, and almost 1,000 people came, which we never moved, never left, never wavered for those 2.5 hours. And we had our last moments again, and it was strange. You're looking at him, and I just said, "Ryan, this is probably the last time I'll ever say goodnight to you." And gave him a kiss, and we went back to the house. Got up early the next morning, because it was the day of the funeral, and I wanted to get over to the funeral house like at 6 o'clock in the morning, because I'm an early riser. I wanted to spend as much time as I could, but knowing you can't, that was just where I was at. And we got over there like 9 o'clock in the morning, and spent some time, and you're not realizing it, but it's the last time you're ever going to see him, in the flesh. And that was probably one of the hardest moments when we were closing the casket. Is saying goodbye to your child.
Yeah, I've lost someone close to me, so I understand that moment of closing the casket. Go ahead.
Yeah, it was, I've lost my father, years before this, and my father-in-law, and it was devastating when that happened. But this was totally different than that. When it happened, the progression of life part wasn't part of this. you're burying your child, I think is what got to me more than anything at that moment. You gave him a kiss and the door went down and that was it. So that got us, through the funeral, and we stayed another day or so because we cremated Ryan, and that was a hard thing to do because I didn't know whether my wife wanted to move back to Pennsylvania or not at this point, being that's where most of the family was, other than my son Kevin. But there was reasons why we moved. It was the start of our life. We were in our 50s, and started to be an empty nesters and it's something new. So we brought him. We waited till Saturday. We picked up the urn, and the strangest thing was, Sunday when we were getting ready to leave to the airport, my son Kevin wanted to carry him, and Kevin had one of his hats, and he put the hat on top of the urn on the bag because Ryan was never without a hat. And he carried him through the airport, carrying him onto that airplane, and he hung on to that bag so tight. And we came home, had the urn in the house, but we were going to intern him eventually in the next couple of weeks in Florida here. And that's when real reality started to hit, because now my son's back to his house, getting back to work. My daughter's up north, and it's just my wife and I now.
Yeah,
we just sat. Yep.
I can remember that feeling, after losing someone. I mean, I haven't been through anything as traumatic as you have, but the day after, the amount of visits is, it dwindles exponentially until you're all alone within, a couple of days after everything is done. It's like almost like nothing happens because everybody else has to go back to their lives.
Right. Yeah, it's an eerie feeling for days. And at that point, we knew it wasn't over. Just that part of it was over. Now we still had the investigation going.
Yes.
And we didn't.
Go ahead.
We had no idea what that process was going to be.
Yes, so I'm going to ask you a little bit about that process. While you were giving me the story, I kind of looked over here at my Google and I saw the name David Earl Williams Jr. So lead us up to that.
Okay. So soon after the funeral, we came home, and the investigation started to heat up. I would get almost daily, weekly phone calls from the detective on the investigation, who they were looking at, possible leads, and, this, and then if this didn't lead somewhere, and it was constant, and 6 months would go by and nothing. Another 6 months, it's a year, nothing. The detective, they kind of had a feeling in the beginning of someone, but they just couldn't get there yet. Then 2 years, nothing. So here we are, still living in, working your way through the grief cycle and not getting any place yet in getting a person arrested in the investigation end. So, I was one where I was never frustrated because I wanted the police to be able to do their jobs with that intervention from us, because we don't know what's going on and we don't know how to do that. Internally, you were frustrated, yeah. In yourself, fighting with yourself, and with my wife and I, you start to become very distant now. Now the marriage is changing. A year in, the death, the blames games start, and there's an investigation, and there's no arrest and nothing going on. And that became our struggle now through this process, is trying to hold our marriage together through this whole thing. And that's one thing I swore wouldn't happen, that our marriage wouldn't fall apart. And during all this process, the victim advocate, we went to them, and we had a counselor, and we would go see the counselor through this process through the years, the first year, and they're there to help us work our way through the grief processes along with the legal end of it all, and how that all works, and helping us through that, and not knowing it was going to take the time it's taking. And then we're into the third year, and in the third year, it was in May, I get a phone call that they finally nailed down enough to make an arrest.
Let me pause you right there. Mm-hmm. I don't want to skip over something that's really important, because I've had this conversation with various people, and it is a statistic that when a married couple loses a child, it's a very high percentage that the marriages are destroyed. And that is usually, like you said, through the guilt and the blame. It creates a distance, and an involuntary distance between two people. I remember when I was, I don't know how old I was, maybe 8 or 9 years old. My uncle, my father's brother, and his wife, my cousin, died. It was something that was, he was in Brooklyn, in New York, and he was playing baseball and watching the game, and the kid swung at the ball, and the bat flew out his hand and hit my cousin in his head. And basically he went down, his brain twisted in his head, it got swollen, not to digress from your story, but I say that because they managed to keep their marriage together. But the story that we're giving here, I want the audience to understand each step of what you as a parent are going through, and at the same time as a husband, and what the struggle was. So go ahead.
Right. Yeah. The major struggle between the two of us was, you worked your way through the blaming part, but you just to touch each other didn't feel right anymore. That was, I know for the both of us, that was the hardest thing. Like you were saying, it's not intentional. You didn't want those things to happen. There was times where you're like, we're done here. It's over. We'll work through this, but when, this is over, it's done. We're done with each other. It wasn't the two of you that was causing it. It was the loss. And now the investigation, because you think that's very important to you at this time, that you find someone that murdered your child. So, my wife and I, it wasn't like a lot of fighting. It was more like just distance from each other. One room to another room. You would talk, but it became generic talk. And for my wife and I, we've known each other. I've known her since she was 14 years old, and at that time we were married 30 years. So it's not like we didn't know each other. And I think it was the frustration of being distanced from each other was hurting us mentally, not knowing how to fix it. And going to counseling during all this was actually never knowing it was the most important thing to do. And in the beginning, I knew that in one respect, that there was no way we could work through this by ourselves and hopefully keep not just our marriage, but our family together. Because there was some distancing between my children at the same time, because they see their mom and dad disappearing. And we don't know how they're feeling because I'm a father and a husband, and my wife's a wife and a mother. And they were worried about us as we were worrying about them. So the whole dynamics of the family starts to pick and drop away. And that's through, that's the thing that we were trying to hold together. And when when May came of 2012 and we get my wife and I decided to go away and hopefully, for a few days, we went up to St. Augustine in Florida and hopefully maybe start to, connect a little bit, forget about everything that's going on and, just try to maybe start to try and find each other. And of course, boom, detective calls me the first day we're on a vacation. Well, and he says, we're going to be making an arrest. And they knew we were away because we told everybody, we're going to, the arrest is coming. We're, we finally have someone. And when, they want to know when we're coming back. And I said, well, we're staying here till we had like 3 or 4 days. And they said, okay, we'll hold off on making it they'll do the arrest and get all the paperwork done. But, of course, they wanted us on a news conference and set all that up. So now the whole process, the reason why we're going away changed again. Now we start to get the getting at each other just because you don't know what's coming. You don't know what's going to happen when you go back and what's coming from that. Now you're into the next realm of your child being murdered. So we end up getting back, and the Tampa police the chief of police sets up a press conference for us. And now that we're at the police department and the news media is there, and you're looking out over the news media and you're like, wow, this ain't ending. We're 3 years into this and we haven't been able to grieve and properly work through the loss yet, through the struggle. And I had to give a little talk and, a little speech. I gave something small. Of course, then they would ask questions and my son Kevin was there, and heartbreaking, my daughter being in Philadelphia, she couldn't fly down for it, so she was missing things. So her anxiety through this, because she was away from the area, and your heart was breaking that she couldn't be part of it, and just that whole dynamics of that, the arrest, you thought was going to okay, this is over. And we get done the press conference, we go down, we start talking, and now it's okay. Now it's the legal end, the justice system, and you'll go from that you're thinking it's over, but it's not over. So we meet, that we go and we meet with the state attorney's office, and they sit down and tell us, the arrest, they made the arrest, and he was going to be brought back to Tampa in a couple of days after that. And at that point, we only know a name, we don't have a face. And he just goes through the whole what's going to happen when we get to trial, and tells us right then and there it's going to be at least 2 years to get to trial. And we're like, wow. So we leave there, we go home. 3 days later, he's being brought back into Tampa because he was in jail for another crime that he committed right after he murdered Ryan. And they were bringing him back to Tampa. And the first time we got to see him was on the news when they were bringing him out of the police car to take him into the jail in Tampa. So now we're trying to work our way through the arrest and getting ready for a trial. So at that point, now we start going through all the setups for the trial and all the pre-trial hearings. I never missed one. I was at every single one. And there was a couple times I get there and David Williams wasn't in the courtroom, and I asked the state attorney, "Can he be here?" He said, "Sure, we'll bring him in." And my thought was, if I have to be here, you're going to be out here. So, my wife, she was at most of them, one or two she missed, just, her work that she couldn't do it. So I made sure I went to every single one. And we get through the 2 years, and then it went on up to 3 years. In the meantime, we've been keeping ourselves busy, doing a lot of things through all this. We started a foundation. We were doing fundraisers in Ryan's name. So we kind of created something that started to give us some hope and some pathway to healing. And we got, and through this whole thing that kept us going, and we get to the trial in April of 2015, right? And now we're almost 6 years since Ryan was murdered. And we were all preparing ourselves for the trial. And of course, since it's a murder, you're, as a family, you're asked, to put your input in for, whether it's going to be a death penalty case or not. And of course, as a family, you're sitting there like, now we got to think about this. So we all talked about it. We all came to the same conclusion from different places that we'd rather not have him put to death. Not that you might want it, but there is reasons why we all came to it that we didn't want to. That really wasn't a driving thing for the prosecutor not to do it, but they do ask us, so it became a process for us to like, okay, now we got to think, So we get through that process, and we get the trial. They're not doing a death penalty case. And we walked in the courtroom that day, and they bring the jurors in, and the courtroom's just filled with people on our side. And we just, you were so numb. It was a weird feeling. You weren't looking for anything, because I told my wife before it started, remember, no matter what happens in the courtroom and when it ends, we still go home and we're still who we are. So don't expect a guilty or a non-guilty verdict to make you better or not better. But she thought getting the guilty verdict would be her release.
Well, was it? Because I'm reading here that, and I'm doing a quick survey of the whole story, and I'm surprised I never saw this story before. But how long did the actual trial take? Because I see that obviously he was convicted.
Right, 5 days.
And 3-hour deliberation.
Right.
And according to what I'm reading here, you got life without the possibility of parole.
Yes.
Okay. What did that do or did it, if anything, did it do anything for your wife or for you?
Well, when it ended, the guilty verdict came, we all cried. Everybody, we all stood there and cried and hugged each other. There was no joy. It was just pure sadness and relief.
Yes, I'm reading here where you told the judge, today is the end of August 19, 2009.
Right.
So
that ended that day.
Right. 5, how many years later is that? 5?
almost 6 years.
Almost 6 years later. And I know there's a lot more details you could tell us about the trial, but you may have that may have to be a separate episode, because I don't want to give any. I'm sitting here listening to your whole story, and I have all these different emotions in me as a father. I've got, and I can't even describe some of them, but I can tell you that one of them is anger. So I don't want to give much time in this story to I'll call his name again, for that despicable human being, David Earl Williams, Jr., I think it is. But before we sort of wrap up this story, tell us a bit about the Ryan McCall Foundation.
Okay, yeah, we started it out of a realm of my son saying, "Hey, let's," they were both runners, so along with the cross country coach and my son Kevin and his friends said, "Hey, why don't we just have a run?" So we decided to have a run in 1 year, and it went off pretty well. So we started the foundation not soon after that, and continued to have a fundraising run in Tampa in every April, and then we had a fundraising event up in Pennsylvania every February, right, when Ryan's birthday was in February, so that's where we had that. And we raised money to give scholarships to high school students down here in Florida, and also with the high school that Ryan went to in Downingtown West. As the years went on, we partnered up with the Children's Cancer Center here in Tampa, deciding to raise money for the Cancer Center to help the families going through things that they were going to be going through. So as a family, we thought that would be the best thing to do. And then we also hooked up with Connect Through Cancer, a cancer group up in Philadelphia area that sort of does the same thing. They just help families. There's no research involved. It's helping families in their time of need, going through hardships. And that's where our foundation has morphed into now, where we're trying more to help families in their time of their need.
And that is an amazing way to honor your son, honor the person he was, keeping his memory alive and keeping who he would have been today alive. I want you to do one more thing for me before we wrap up this episode, and that is, as a father, as a husband, as a survivor of losing a child to a homicide, I want you, whatever your message is in a nutshell, whatever you want to say out to the audience, whether it be to a parent who loses a child or to someone despicable enough to take the life of that child, what would your message be?
The major thing that I would, it's kind of hard for me to give advice, but if something happens in your family, drastic and takes a part of your soul away, is to try and keep your compassion and the love for yourself and your family, because that's the most important thing when something like this happens, is keeping your family close to you and holding on to them, because we all grieve from different places in your family. A son, a daughter, a mother, and a father, we all have different grieving process. But being close to each other, even if you don't speak a word, don't offer advice unless you're asked, is my biggest thing. And the one of the biggest, to friends or family members, I always said to them, please don't try to understand, just be understanding.
That is, and I understand what you mean by that. Having dealt with a law student, in my own way, I understand, and that is a powerful but truthful, and I think necessary message for people to understand, because what the tendency is, what the inclination is, and what's actually needed is two different things.
Right.
But I thank you so much, Kevin, for let me say this, and
would you
go ahead.
Would you mind if I mentioned my book?
No, absolutely. No, absolutely. Yeah.
Real quick. Yeah. Well, through all this, I'll do a quick summary of it. I started journalizing soon after Ryan died, suggested from our support counselor, and I never thought I would ever write anything. So I started journalizing every day, periodically from day to day, and it turned in almost every day. So I decided to write a book about a year ago, and I called For the Love of Family, How a Knock on the Door Changed Everything. It's my actual journals put in a book. It's the entries. It'll be January 21st, 2010, or August 19th, 2013. Whatever entry I put in is what's in the book. It kind of gives you a pathway for anybody who has lost anybody, especially a child. After I read it myself, I never read the journals until I decided to do the book. And it's a pathway that everybody goes through, but different ways. And it gives them an outlook on where a family might be when they have a loss, even if it's not a child. So yeah. I recommend anybody to pick it up and read it. I've been thanked by by people who read it that I didn't know that lost a child, and thanked me for writing a book so truthful.
And where can people find this book?
Amazon, Barnes and Nobles.
Fantastic. And you've heard Kevin talk about the book there. For my audience and all those who are interested, it sounds like it would be an amazing read and a very emotional read. The link to the book will be in the body of the podcast when you listen to this episode. So, from what I've heard tonight, from what we've all heard tonight, I would tell you to go out and get the book and digest it at your own pace and understand that none of us are immune to this happening in our lives. First, let me say again, thank you, Kevin, so much for not only agreeing to do this episode, not only doing what you and your family are doing in Ryan's name, but being, what I would feel from my perspective, strong enough and driven enough to recount this story. I'm sure this is not the first time, and in such detail. I think when my audience probably starts out listening to this episode, they would think it's, we're going to talk about your son dying and then go into the whole trial and the perpetrator and all of that part about it. And what you brought in this episode is the human side, step by step, of what a family goes through as a father, as a mother, as a brother, as a sister. I think that, we as human beings have gotten to a place in this world where we're so careless about life and we're so complacent about it. I despise the fact that someone feels that they have the right to even commit an act that could result in the loss of another human life. We didn't create it. We have no right to take it. And I am very affected by hearing your story as a parent, and I just can't imagine. And you sound so composed. I understand that this is years later, but I just can't imagine dealing with this. It's as I was listening to you, I felt like I should just go bury my head under a pillow or something, because I can't imagine just dealing with the emotions and everything else of this. And so it's amazing that you share the story, but it's, for everyone out there, For those who have lost, and I'm doing a mini series, and this is the second episode in this mini series, you have people like Kevin that you can turn to for support. You have the Ryan McCall Foundation, and you don't have to go through those struggles by yourself, no matter where you are. If you hear this episode and you're hurting and you need help, reach out to me, and I'm sure Kevin would mind connecting with you to help you. But I also want to say, we live in such a violent time now that I want to say this to the next person who picks up a gun or a knife and feels that it somehow empowers them and it's a way to something. You don't have a right to take something from someone that's not yours. In this case, the perpetrator didn't even get a dime from Ryan, as I'm reading. He got nothing. All he did was take a life and basically be a destructive force, not only in your family's life, but in this world. And I don't know whether this message will change one person's mind whose habit is to pick up a gun or a knife, or rather than go out and earn an honest wage, they decide the easiest way is to take something from someone else. If it changes one, then it's made a difference. But I think my audience will wonder what happened to me in this episode, because I'm usually very talkative throughout the episode and I could hardly speak. So thank you again so much on so many levels. Maybe after I read, and I will take the time in between our busy schedule to also read your book, and I may have additional questions that maybe we'll ask you to come back on if the Sure. Details of the trial warrant it. As I said, I don't like to give too much airtime to the perpetrators. I'm not into that, right. And I feel like they should just be. He got life in prison without parole, and he just should remain there silently till the end of his time. So, this has probably been my most emotional conclusion of an episode on this podcast. But again, I thank you so much, and it's been an absolute pleasure. I wish you and your family the best. And like I said, if anyone reaches out, I'll be sure to make that connection. So thank you so much for being in the episode.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It was my pleasure to tell my story. Stories have to be told like this sometimes. And your message that you just gave was so wonderful.
Oh, thank you so much, Kevin. I want to say a very, very, very special thank you to my guest, Kevin McCall, for this episode, for taking not only the time, but having the ability to recount every detail of every parent's worst nightmare. I want to also thank him for the Ryan McCall Foundation and for all that he's doing to be support to others who go through this type of tragedy. Also want to, as always, thank my audience and my supporters out there for your continued support. Reminding you you can listen to every episode or any episode of this podcast on your favorite podcast app. You can also head over to the website at www.247realtalk.net, where you have all the episodes and details about the guests. If you'd like to be a guest on the show, or if you'd like to send me a message, you can email me at podcast@247realtalk.net. That's podcast@247realtalk.net. Until the next time, do take care of yourselves and each other.